Chapter 9. The Race. After a few weeks, said the old man, I began to think it might be a good idea to give up school as a bad job. I had no friends to speak of, and every day Toby Lovely made things harder and harder for me. One day he sawed off the legs of my chair, so that when I sat down I fell to the floor and hurt myself. Another day he put a bucket of varnish over the door, and when I walked in it fell all over me and I had to have 2 baths in 1 week. He stole my homework and ate my apples, tied the laces of my boots together and mispronounced my name. He said I came from outer space and had jelly where my brain should be. He put a frog down the back of my trousers and a ferret down the front, which was actually more fun than he'd imagined it would be. Oh, I could go on and on with the terrible things he did to me. He walked beside me for a whole afternoon wearing a pullover with an arrow pointing in my direction and underneath it the words, "I'm with stupid." He spent every Wednesday morning speaking to me in Japanese, at which he was actually quite proficient, and I started to pick up a few words. He poured salt in my porridge and put sugar in my sandwiches. He persuaded everyone in the class to wear hats for a day so that I was the odd man out. He sent me flowers and signed them with a big kiss from someone called Alice. It was terrible, terrible, terrible! I started to dread going to school and didn't think that things could get any worse, until they did. It was a Tuesday morning, and Mrs. Shields was going around the room discussing what jobs we all might like to have in the future, which might have been a little premature, as we were only 8 years old at the time. But she said we should all plan for our future, even at this early stage. She wanted to know not only what we wanted to be when we grew up, but what our parents were now. "My father is an international film star," said Marjorie Willingham, "and my mother is an astronaut. I hope to be a helicopter pilot." "Very good, Marjorie," said Mrs. Shields, nodding appreciatively. "And you, Jasper Bennet, what do your parents do?" "My father is working on a cure for the runny nose. My mother is a horse whisperer, and I have ambitions towards the priesthood." "And if you set your mind to it, you will achieve all your goals," she declared happily. "Matthew Byron, how about you?" "My father is the head of the armed forces," said Matthew, "and my mother helps people avoid paying income tax. I plan on being a professional footballer until I'm 34 and a half, at which point I will turn my attentions to becoming the poet laureate." "So ambitious!" Mrs. Shields smiled. "Toby Lovely, I'm sure your parents are wonderful role models." "They are," admitted Toby Lovely. "You know those slides that go round and round and round, and when you come out the other end of them you land in a swimming pool?" "I do," said Mrs. Shields. "Well, my father invented them." "Fascinating," said Mrs. Shields. "And your mother?" "She invented swimming pools. That was how they met." "Of course. And how about you? What would you like to be when you grow up?" "An athlete," said Toby Lovely. "I am the fastest boy in school, after all." He smiled rather smugly and received warm applause from the rest of the class. "You are indeed," said Mrs. Shields, looking around carefully. "Now, is that everyone? No one was left out?" Every boy and girl in the class nodded, except me, which I immediately regretted, for Mrs. Shields noticed this and pointed in my direction. "I do apologise," he said. "And what do your parents do?" I swallowed nervously as I stood up. "My father is a toy maker," I said. "Mostly puppets, but a few other things as well. He's very good with his hands." "Charming," said Mrs. Shields. "Everyone needs toys. Well, until their late 20s anyway. And your mother, what does she do?" I was a little surprised that she was asking me this, and I bowed my head for a moment. "Oh, of course," she said. "I'm so sorry, I forgot. You don't have a mother, do you?" "No, miss," I said, shaking my head. "Did she die?" "No, miss," I said. "Did she run away?" "No, miss," I said. She seemed surprised by this and frowned. "Well, where is she then? She couldn't have just vanished into thin air, surely." "I never had a mother," I said. "Never had a mother?" replied Toby Lovely, turning round to stare at me in amazement. "I've never heard anything so ridiculous in all my life." "Then you haven't heard yourself sing," I replied, astonished by my own bravery in standing up to him, but leaving him lost for words, for he simply stared at me and began to seethe quietly. I knew I wouldn't have heard the end of this, and sure enough, a few hours later, in the playground, he came up to me and gave me a slap across the back of the head as a reward for my cheek. "How does anyone never have a mother?" he asked. "It's not as if you were carved out of wood or something." "It's just one of those things," I said. "I never had a mother. You never had a brain. We all have some things that make us stand out from the crowd." And there it was again. Maybe it was the months of bullying that led me to the point where I just felt I couldn't take another moment of it. Toby Lovely stared at me and laughed for a moment in astonishment before pawing the ground with his foot like a bull preparing to charge, and then jumped on top of me, the two of us rolling around in a great bundle of raised fists and pulling hair as everyone else crowded around and cheered us on, delighted to see the all too rare spectacle of a great fight. I lushed out in all quarters, and when we were finally separated by Mr. Wickle, the games teacher, I was delighted to see that I had given Toby Lovely a bloody nose, although not so pleased to feel the bruises on my ears and the blackened eye that was starting to bulge on my face. "What's all this about?" asked Mr. Wickle. "Boys fighting in my playground? I won't have it! What are you fighting about anyway?" I couldn't take it anymore and roared at the top of my voice. "He thinks he's better than me and he's not!" "Am too," said Toby Lovely. "Are not," I countered. "Am too," said Toby Lovely. "Are not, am too, are not." All right, said Mr. Wickle, silencing us both. "That's enough, the pair of you. Look," he said, turning to me. "Toby Lovely is one of the brightest stars the school has ever produced. He won 4 gold medals on our last sports day after all. He runs faster than anyone I know. If he says he's better than you, surely you can let him get away with it. Though, as for you," he added, turning to Toby Lovely, "you should have more humility." "You're right," said Toby Lovely, reaching across to shake my hand. "I should simply accept my superiority and not look down my nose at others." "I could beat you in a race," I said, shrugging my shoulders, not even thinking about the words before I said them. Every voice in the schoolyard went silent when I said that, and remained silent for the best part of an hour. Finally, Mr. Wickle's stomach started to rumble, and we all shook ourselves out of it. "For shame," he said, shaking his head and looking at me with great pity in his eyes. "That's an outrageous thing to say." "But it's true," I said. "It's not," said Toby Lovely. "It's too," I replied. "Enough," said Mr. Wickle. "If you think you are a faster runner than the most brilliant athlete the school has produced since the great Dmitri Kapaldi, then there's only one way to prove it. We shall have a race." The school sent up a great cheer, and with extraordinary speed separated down the centre into 2 ranks. The boys all stood on one side, the girls on the other, and they stared across at each other with their usual mixed expressions of fear and interest. Between them both, at the top of the line, stood Toby Lovely and I, with Mr. Wickle in between us. From the school itself ran Mrs. Shields, carrying a pair of trainers. "Toby's trainers!" she said, gasping for breath. "He can't run without his lucky trainers." "Do you have trainers with you?" Mr. Wickle asked me, looking down at my hobnail boots. "No, sir," I said, "but it doesn't matter. He can wear them if he likes. I'll still beat him." "Fine, I will then," said Toby Lovely, slipping them on, and we knelt down in our starting positions. "Look ahead, boys," said Mr. Wickle. "You see that apple tree in the distance? It's half a mile away. The first boy to bring me back an apple will be declared the winner. Are you ready?" And here we have a picture of a pair of hobnail boots and another apple. Note, no bite. "Ready, sir!" we cried, and I wondered what I'd got myself into, for I'd never run a race in my life, let alone against someone like Toby Lovely, who was indeed a very fast runner. "Set! Set, sir!" we said, and I swallowed nervously, peering ahead towards the tree, deciding that whatever happened, I would try to give a good account of myself and not fall too far behind. "Go!" I raced forward, looking neither left nor right, completely unaware of how far my opponent might have been ahead of me, and when I reached the tree I grabbed an apple, spun round and raced back, popping it into Mr. Wickle's outstretched hand. Suddenly aware of how quiet the 2 rows of spectators had become. Turning round, I saw Toby Lovely only a few metres away, stopping, looking back at me in astonishment. He'd hardly even left his starting position, and I'd been there and was back already. "Good Lord!" said Mr. Wickle, shaking his head. "Now there's a surprise."